Welcome to Managing Sexuality Intelligently. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Stephen Ng, marriage and family therapist. Welcome, Stephen.
Hey, thanks. I'm glad we're having these talks because I think it's going to be helpful. It's almost like free therapy for people who are maybe not ready to get into therapy or who just want to think about these ideas a little bit before they step into a therapist's office. Hopefully, it'll be helpful.
Yeah, it's a good little way to get your feet wet without jumping in completely.
Right.
What we do here is we just chat about a topic that I present to Steve. The topic is planned ahead by me. Steve has no idea what I'm going to hit him with, and we just kind of have a improv chat with it all. So today we were discussing intimacy. I personally didn't really know what intimacy was or understand the importance of it until I was 37 years old. I've had intimate relationships and friendships, but I wasn't exactly conscious of how the intimacy was working, how I was building it, and so on. Through working with Steve, I was able to gain a much deeper understanding of intimacy and how it's a major part in creating and maintaining a safe, healthy, and loving, long-term, committed romantic relationship. And before we get into all that, if you have a question for Steve, you could visit stephening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so be sure to stay tuned for that. All right, Steve, my question to start is, when did you first become aware of intimacy and what did it look like for you?
Well, I'm laughing because I'm thinking about the ways I use the word now versus the way I learned the term, which when I was young, watching Perry Mason, the original Perry Mason show, not the new remake, and invariably, if there was a sort of a non-marital relationship where two people were sexually involved, at some point the prosecutor or Perry Mason himself, the defense attorney, would lean forward and say, "Were you and the defendant ever intimate?" And that was acceptable for public television back then, the public airwaves. But it was basically a euphemism for having sex. Did you and the defendant ever have sex? And
was that like a universal thing, or is that something that just with that TV show?
Oh, actually, I think it was in the language. It was the way polite people talked about doing it.
Okay.
You know,
so like we were intimate last night.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what's funny about that? I mean, what is it, 2023? Just a few more days of this year, and people are still using it in the same way in my office. And I mean, people with educations, people with very little education who just got out of prison. But, you know, they'll say, well, my girlfriend and I became intimate this week. And it's, and I always ask them, you know, kind of mischievously with a twinkle, do you mean you had sex? And they'll nod their heads nervously. And, you know, the reason I think that we need to redeem the word for a higher calling is that it's pretty easy nowadays to just say, did you guys have sex?
Yeah.
And sexual intercourse is an activity that two human beings can engage in consensually or non-consensually. So we can have two people deeply in love with hearts full of respect, engaging in lovemaking, or we could have a criminal drag a victim into an alley and rape is committed. And sex occurs, intercourse occurs, but the one we probably would call intimate, the other one we would say is not intimate. So I don't like using the word intimate or intimacy to describe sexual intercourse. And I think there are lots of other fun ways of talking about doing it.
Yeah.
And but there's a uniqueness to this term. And it was an author, I can't even remember his name now. It was one of those ones that are a little challenging for me because it was Italian. I'm not even sure how I can pronounce his name. But he's an American guy, and he wrote the book on intimacy, and I think it's just called Intimacy. And he planted the idea. I bought the book.
Yeah. How old were you, or when was it?
Oh, gosh, this is probably 25 years ago.
And so were you in your first, or you were after, this is after your first marriage?
After my first marriage.
And what about your first marriage, really quick? Like, what about intimacy then? Was that on your radar? Or was it still intimacy was
No, I
being
was
intimate was
struggling with how to express myself. I didn't really have the language to express myself. You know, one of my favorite quotable philosophers is Wittgenstein, who said, if I don't have the words to describe a thing, then I cannot understand that thing.
yeah.
And I think he was right. And my own experience bears that out. I knew that there was something missing from our marriage, but I just couldn't figure out how to describe it to her. And she knew it was a problem too, but she also didn't have the language to describe it. And I think as I tried to fumble my way around it, she perceived that something that was missing as being her fault, that she was doing something wrong, or and that I wanted more of it and she didn't. But I don't really think that was a healthy way to look at it. So this book, what he did that was instrumental is he defined it first of all, and the definition, I believe I have this correct. He said intimacy is defined as the ability to safely share our lives with one another. And that's a good starter, but he'd made even more points with me, at least, by delineating the types of intimacy one could have. For example, the and each one comes with its own definition.
You mean like missionary doggy style?
No, I mean, like, can you remember back when you were in college or grad school? Was there at least one professor you remember being just amazing? Somebody you could really communicate with?
I'm thinking back. Yes, there's a few I can think of.
Right. So, and I have had the privilege of having a few of those. And what was lovely about those relationships was this was a person who was introducing me to ideas, and I could talk to that person about those ideas in depth. And it was, I would say, a good time was had by all.
Yeah.
So what we enjoyed is what this author would call intellectual intimacy, the ability to safely share our ideas with one another. And for me, that isn't just something for intellectuals. I, as a father, if I were seated, or now as a grandfather, if I were seated with a small child looking up at the moon at night, on a warm summer evening, I can imagine asking the question, well, so what do you think the moon is made of? And a very young child might say something childish like, well, it's made of green cheese. Everybody knows that. And I could respond by smiling and chuckling a little bit. I might even say something funny in return, or asking a follow-up questions like, so how do you think they found out about the cheese? And then getting the whole story about how the astronauts started chewing on it and all of that. But what I don't want to do is say, well, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard.
Yeah.
We've sent people to the moon and they've come back with rocks. It's made of rocks and dirt. And we know that for a fact. And you better learn that.
It's a real American grandfather for you.
Right. So that would be the opposite of intimacy because it's not safe. So I don't have to be an intellectual talking about big ideas. In a relationship, two people can share ideas with one another safely. And by safely, I mean, like I might share an idea about, say, the intentional interview, and somebody, say, a man I'm trying to help, might say, but isn't that a little bit like an interrogation? I mean, really, I think I'd feel uncomfortable with that. And again, I could say, well, don't be stupid.
Yeah.
Come on, snap out of it.
Yeah.
Or I could gently and patiently explain to him the idea a little bit better, and to say, well, and if, I've never really thought about the difference, but now that you bring up interrogation, it's different in that an interrogation is non-consensual, and it's one-sided, and it's painful, and it really isn't about developing a closer rapport. It's really about pulling information out of somebody's head. That's not what the intentional interview is about at all. And most people are going to be able to get that. So I'm actually beholden to the other person for bringing up the question, even though the questioner might not be getting what I'm laying down. It makes it apparent to me I need to do a better job of more clearly explaining my ideas. So in this book, he came up with, I believe, at least 9 different dimensions of intimacy. There might have been more. And if I can recall them, they correspond to different dimensions of the human experience. So spiritual intimacy would be the ability to safely share our spirituality together, and emotional intimacy would be the ability to safely share our feelings, and recreational intimacy would be the ability to safely share having fun with the other person. Social intimacy would be the ability to safely share socializing with that person. Now, I want to give examples of what it isn't or how we fall short, because I've thought about this an awful lot. And as you know, I've done a pretty in-depth debriefing of my failed relationship history prior to my current marriage.
Yes.
And in that, I remember getting into the car after going out to a party or some kind of get together with my wife, my then wife, and I was pretty happy. I remember being pretty happy getting into the car for the drive home. Well, that was fun, wasn't it? And she would give me one of those slow stares and say, well, you had fun. Oh, didn't you have fun? I had fun. Yeah, I had fun. Didn't you? How come you didn't have fun? And then the ride home was like the longest drive in the history of humanity in the automobile, because it was all the things I did wrong, the things I didn't do right, what I should have done more of. And I grew to loathe any kind of social gathering for those reasons. At least the two of us, we couldn't safely socialize together. And similarly, when it came to recreation, I myself have been critical of others I was recreating with, or cajoling and controlling when it would come time to, well, let's do this. This will be a lot of fun. No, you'll like it. Even when the other person made it really clear they wouldn't like it. And I remember my own wife standing up to me and saying, early in our relationship, long before we were married, saying, yeah, I'm not that kind of person.
Yeah.
I'm never going to go backpacking. And I laughed, and I mean, once I internalized it as like, yeah, I don't even need her to go do that with me. We have plenty of fun doing other things, and we can recreate. She and I can recreate joyfully together and safely. But part of what made, if you think about it, instead of if listeners can think about it in terms of all or nothing, yes or no, but more in terms of a continuum, say from 1 to 10. And if 10 is the highest, deepest level of intimacy one could enjoy, and 1 would be the least, like very close to 0, let's say, where it just doesn't feel safe at all. When I go hiking or backpacking, my wife is delighted that I go. She's delighted I'm having fun. She's delighted to make a special meal upon my return, and she wants to hear all about the trip. I think that's a really good example of recreational intimacy, even if we aren't doing it together.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, and I think it's the same, I'm going to say, with spiritual intimacy, and I'll even go so far as to say sexual intimacy, because spiritual intimacy, I think, got interpreted by me when I was younger and didn't understand anything really, by the idea that we both believed the same things.
Yeah.
We attended the same church. We subscribed to the same kinds of proclamations of faith. But I don't think that that's true at all, any more than two people have sexual intimacy by necessarily having the same genitalia. So as a heterosexual, the differences for me are part of what makes my relationship sexually interesting. And I wouldn't want my wife to have the same wedding tackle that I have, when we go into the bedroom.
Yeah.
So if I can do that with sexuality, why can't I do that with spirituality and have a spiritual intimacy with someone who's maybe of a completely different faith than I am, or in my case, I really don't have a faith other than a secular one in humanism. But I think I could be very comfortable with a person of Islamic faith or Christian faith or Jewish faith or any other faith, so long as both of us were able to be tolerant of one another.
Yeah.
And that's a new thing for me because I don't
Mm.
think I was, in my previous life as a young man, I don't think I was at all tolerant of that kind of diversity. I'd been taught there's a verse that gets pulled out of context: "Do not be unequally yoked," and basically it's used as an excuse for exhorting believers to always marry within the faith.
Mm.
But I don't really think that does people any favors.
Yeah.
And I understand people might want to raise their children in a certain way, but I think that's a discussion people could have. And I'm not anti-religion, per se. I think the reason I've stepped away from it is because of the watching religion mess with people's sexuality in unhelpful ways.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of intimacy, I could listen to anybody who is a devout believer or even just a kind of a, what do we call them, a C&E Christian who just goes to church on Christmas and Easter. I could do that, and I could be very comfortable doing that. I don't know that I would always, or that I would ever go along, attending services, but
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be doing anything to sabotage that
Yeah.
experience.
And you'd be home with a meal or
Oh,
a drink,
absolutely.
asking them questions about it.
Yeah, how was
being,
church today?
yeah.
Or what did the rabbi say in the synagogue? I
Yeah.
mean, I would have no trouble with any of that because wisdom is wisdom, and it's always interesting to know what's going on in the life of someone you love.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about intimacy, there are all these dimensions to which, I've in my own non-humble way, I've added a few dimensions that I think are worth talking about. And I would include fiscal intimacy, the ability to safely share talking about finances.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of couples can't do that without getting into a shouting match.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would also add historic intimacy, which goes along with the idea of giving you permission to have a history before you got into that relationship.
Mm.
So,
and being able to share that with one another without judgment or name calling or eye rolling or
right. So if she said, I'm thinking of that movie Mr. and Mrs. Smith, where he's in the back seat of the SUV asking her how many people she's had sex with,
mm-hmm.
and because he's found out she's a spy or a secret agent of some kind, and he's got his number in his head, and his number is very impressive in his own mind, and then he asks Angelina Jolie's character what's her number, and she gives a shorter number or a smaller number, and then starts thinking about, and then her number grows and it grows and it grows until it's like he doesn't want to hear anymore.
Yeah.
So, I think for any of us, I mean, ideally looking at a relationship in theory, if you look at all the dimensions of intimacy and you look at that scale that runs from 0 to 10, which one would you be willing to give up? Now, therapists routinely will say, well, you could probably do without 3. But when I look at the list, that includes emotions and ideas and talking about money and sexuality and all these other things, like I wouldn't want to give up any of it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that
Right.
I'd want all of it if you want a truly intimate relationship.
Right. And maybe you'd be tempted to compromise if you were super needy and she said, I don't want to hear anything about your past. Life, as far as I'm concerned, your life began when you met me. Well, and I just, boy,
that red flag.
Yeah, that just wouldn't, that would really be a big red flag for me and a definite turn off. And the same thing with people who are controlling about spirituality or, and when I just didn't think I'd want to give up any of them. So maybe right now she and I are like, when we just meet, we're maybe at a 3. We've talked about, the fact that we're interested in each other, that we like spending time with each other. But we haven't gone too awfully far. We've made it clear that there's a definite interest. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of intimacy, but, I haven't shared anything of my sexual history. I haven't shared anything about what it is I'm looking for in a relationship from a sexual perspective. and nor has she. And I think that would be, I think that kind of intimacy that gets over a 5, if 5 is average on that scale, which I don't know that would be true, but let's call it that for now. I would not be satisfied with an average score. I would want a lot more intimacy than what I see day to day in the lives of the people around me, or in the renderings in television shows when married couples show up and are portrayed as having the kind of relationships they have. I don't want to be in that situation. I really want to know what's going on. And in a sense, my Christian background is an influence on me, because at the end of the day, I do believe that the truth sets us free. I believe even more intimately that the truth is our friend. And so I may have trouble with the truth. I may be uncomfortable with the truth, but I can recognize that as a Stephen Ing problem, and that I need to work on myself. Now, if somebody says, well, I've killed my last 3 husbands, I do appreciate that disclosure. That was great. I'm glad she felt free to open up, but it very likely would be a deal breaker in terms of going forward, and in terms of going forward romantically. I might be willing to go forward in terms of, still getting to know her, because I have a feeling there's a great story there, and maybe even a novel or two, but I'm not sure. It's not like every disclosure in the intentional interview, because that's what we're talking about most of the time, is I want to know everything. But knowing everything always comes with a risk, as does being open and revealing myself to others. Because I might reveal something. Well, let me put that a little more strongly. I will definitely reveal something, if I'm truly open, that will turn off vast swaths of the community. Whether it's my views on spirituality, my views on sexuality, my views on money, it doesn't matter what it is. If people, if someone who's interested in me is dating me, hears me share my opinion, and if they're taking me seriously, and if they're not thinking, well, that's what he thinks now, but I will change him. If they're taking me seriously, there are many people I would be the wrong guy for, right? But I want that kind of intimacy. And friendship, it isn't just within a romance. The people who wrote the Perry Mason show were incorrect, because intimacy is something that we have to some degree with everyone who comes into our lives. So somebody who says, oh, hello, how are you doing? They're taking a risk by letting us know they're interested in how we're doing and in greeting us. And I've had people look at me and say, well, who cares? Or you don't care. And they just walk away. Or they ignore me and walk away. I've had that happen plenty of times. So for me, intimacy is always the question. And we always have a score that's, the only true zeros, I would say, are people who I've never even met. And of course I have zero intimacy with them because I haven't met them. But even somebody, one of the other dimensions was physical intimacy, the ability to safely share physical space. And we have a lot of that in our society. We sit in movie theaters side by side with strangers watching a movie together.
Who gets the armrest? That's really
right. And we also walk the sidewalks together, and counting on a certain level of safety from the general community when we do so. Whereas we know for a fact there are other people in the community who are definitely not safe to be around. So, we've here's another one: vocational intimacy, the ability to work side by side. And I remember my scores, because if you take out a piece of paper and somebody who rewound this episode and wrote down all these ideas, all these dimensions of intimacy, or better yet, they looked up and bought the book written by the guy who wrote the book called Intimacy. Looking for an Italian name as the author. I think we could easily do a post-mortem on any failed relationship by just and evaluating it, kind of like people who are first responders or in the military might, as a critical incident debriefing.
Mm-hmm.
So how much intimacy did we have? And the scores for most of us in failed relationships are going to be, if we're honest,
Yeah.
they're going to be really low.
Yeah.
They're going to be really low. And people don't like to admit that. It's very painful because they stayed married for 10 years or for 15 years, but they never broke through the lower ranks from, say, 0 to 3. They never broke over a 3 to getting any intimacy.
I will say though, really quick, I was gonna say it could also vary because I've had it where it's like the physical intimacy or the space intimacy is really high, but then sexual intimacy is really low, or so I feel like within that dimension there are, I don't know.
Well, for sure, that's why you evaluate each one of the dimensions separately.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to agree with you because the first example I brought up of a university professor who had some amazing ideas in their subject. I've never had sex with any of those people.
Yeah.
And we never talked about sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say we had tons of intellectual intimacy, but no sexual intimacy. Yeah. And there are other people, but I have to say, and I've said this before in previous conversations with you, that I've been in groups where we would talk about sexual fantasies, for example, mm-hmm. which would be a legit subject for a sexual conversation and a legitimate measure of how much sexual intimacy we have. And a guy would share his sexual fantasy, and we would, what our work in group is usually to deconstruct the fantasy and see what makes it exciting to the individual. And there's further insight down the road from doing that. But when somebody shares a sexual fantasy that's a bit naughty, that say includes one of her family members, like her sister or something, mm-hmm. and then I say the question, well, could you ever tell your wife that fantasy? And he always says,
no way,
Steve. She'd kill me. And I think that that's understandable. Although I wouldn't call it desirable, it's certainly understandable that somebody, mm-hmm. but how can a woman really know if a man is never willing to take the risk and share?
Yeah.
And the way we would share, of course, that we've already talked about, is having that meta conversation. Would you ever want to know anything about my sexual fantasies? And I would want to know everything about my partner's sexual fantasies.
Yeah, same.
And I want to know because it's going to help me be a better lover, a better husband. It's going to help me be a more accepting person. I'm going to be able to savor the pleasure of enjoying knowing her all the more. But for my client who made that disclosure, I always point out that his group is perfectly accepting and that we've listened to him and that he has no sense of judgment. Whether he was gay or straight or young or old, married or single, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, not because a group is necessarily about friendship, but it's similar to being in a friendship circle. And I don't think our friends usually judge us for those kinds of comments. And what's weird about it is I could have a lot more sexual intimacy with a group of heterosexual males sometimes than I can with my own partner. And that just kind of boggles my mind, the thought of that.
I feel like that's a common thing too.
Very common, and I think it's for me, troubling and unacceptable. I just,
yes, I agree.
This shouldn't be the way that it is, and I need to do something about that. And it usually starts, intimacy always starts with some courageous person, him or her. Mm-hmm. Somebody takes a risk.
Yeah.
And they risk rejection. And then you only have to do that 4,000 or 5,000 times and you're there. Yeah. But I would argue that for everybody who's interested in doing this, you walk before you run. So let's start off with some small disclosures like my favorite color is, or my zodiac sign is, or this is what I do during my long walks on the beach. And these are the kind of books I like to read. And if the other person isn't matching you, disclosure for disclosure,
Yeah.
even when prompted, um, then I would stop disclosing,
Hmm.
and, kind of read the room,
Yeah.
because they're not that into you,
Hmm.
and you can ask, you can bring it up and they might respond. But if you're always having to ask, that's a red flag.
Is it they're not into you, or it could also be that they're just uncomfortable sharing that stuff with another person, or
Right. And, you're so right for correcting me on that. And yet the outcome is kind of the same. So
yes.
that old saying, a distinction without a difference, I think it sort of applies. I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a difference that's meaningful to me as a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people who may not know how to do these disclosures, they can learn, and they're glad to learn once it's pointed out or brought up to them,
Yeah.
because it's really about the highest goal attainable in our human experience. As humans on this planet, the ability to give and receive love
Mm-hmm.
is really what it's all about. Because if we don't have love, we can't have compassion, we can't have connection that's meaningful with others. So I can honestly say, to this day, some of those university professors and even teachers in elementary school who were so important. I remember Mr. Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to Mr. Hill, who introduced me to science fiction. They just mean the world to me. I
Mm-hmm.
love these people.
Yeah.
Still to this day, I don't even know if they're alive, but I cherish their memory, and I cherish the things that they taught me. And so there's if we're talking about being fully human and the other person doesn't know how to do this,
Mm-hmm.
I go back to that. Did you want to be his therapist, or did you want to be his lover?
Yeah.
And so she has to decide, or he has to decide, does he want to be her guru and she's his little grasshopper?
Mm-hmm.
Because it builds in, if it's going to be that way, then there's this built-in inequality in the relationship.
Yeah.
Now, you can playfully tease. I've had wonderful women who playfully teased me and said, well, what do you mean you don't have a favorite book?
Mm-hmm.
Don't you know how to read? And I can respond by saying, well, yeah, I just love so many, it's hard to think of a favorite.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had to pick today, I guess I'd say today my favorite is, and I can disclose that, and I will disclose that upon request if anybody asks.
What's your favorite book?
Anybody but you. Got to write in.
Pollywog by Stephen Ing.
You got to write in to stephening.com. But I think that most of us have, like, at least a beginner's knowledge about how to make disclosures. But there's so much misdirection out there where people are like promoting rules. There's even a book written by two ladies who were trying to write the book on how to catch a man, called The Rules. And it's been years since they wrote it, but it was full of misinformation, because it actually destroyed the ability to have intimacy in the relationship, and because it was so manipulative.
Yeah.
So if you're still studying books like that, they write them every few years. There's a new one that comes out: how to get girls, how to manipulate people into relationships, how to get sex, how to have sex with whoever. And the goal, I think, is really, the more pleasurable goal is intimacy. And I just, it's like acquiring a taste for a fine food.
Mm.
When you're young, nachos, man, it's nachos.
That was your thing, not
Yeah, or it's peanut butter on a spoon, and that's what I call good eating. Or popcorn loaded with so much butter that it just drips with butter. But if, as you mature and your taste matures, the quality of food goes up. And it's the same way, I think, with human relationships. As we mature, we develop, and it's not that we lose our interest in sex. I still love sex, and I'm approaching an age more appropriate to a graveyard than to a therapy office. But I like the idea, as much as I like the idea of sex, I love the idea of getting to know the other person.
Mm-hmm.
The new client who walks into my office, male or female, I love the idea of getting to know a new person. In a business discussion, I love the idea of getting to know really any new potential friend in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's pleasurable to watch the artful ways that they've learned to present themselves to the other person and the ways that they avoid or embrace certain topics or opportunities. And I just find that endlessly fascinating and far more interesting than just sex.
Yeah.
So, and when I've talked to some young people who've really figured this out, people in their 20s, and
they figured intimacy out.
They have figured out that they love getting to know someone more than they love just having sex.
Yeah, I feel like I had the same sort of thing, but I didn't know what it was called. It's that whole Russian guy, or what was his name? The whole thing we were just talking about.
I
didn't have the words for it. Essentially, I don't know if that was
Austrian guy.
Yeah.
Wittgenstein.
Yes, I didn't have the words for it, but it's like a feeling that I knew I was. And again, like I said in the intro to this, like I just didn't have the words or the definitions or understanding of what intimacy was. Like I think I was like you, kind of. I thought about it in terms of sex, but then understanding with the help of the writer of that book, and then through you, that there's all these dimensions to it, and then that really filled it in for me in a way that was very enlightening.
Yeah, one of the most enjoyable dimensions I've yet to talk about was aesthetic intimacy, the ability to safely share beauty. Now, the Navajo talk about, they have an expression, the way of beauty, living a beautiful life. When I listen to you talk about this the way you did, that just sounds like a really beautiful way of living one's life. And now that you have the words to express yourself, it gets even more beautiful. So you go farther down the road on that journey of the way of beauty. And it's not just about collecting fine art or listening to whatever music we like or wearing whatever fashion really suits us. Certainly that's part of it. But sharing that, that's another whole dimension, because there are still punkers out there who love wearing punk rock outfits daily. And can they do that with you and me in an intimate way where they can feel safe? Or do we make fun of the way they're dressed as if we were back in 6th grade or something? And it's the same way with everybody's clothes and everybody's presentation of self and their hair and the way they groom themselves. All of it's about safely sharing our lives together on all of these different continuums. And I find it endlessly fascinating, and it's a way really to check myself as well, kind of give myself a report card, at the end of the day, like, how did I treat other people? Was it really safe to be around me? Was I making jokes at their expense? Were other people and I laughing at them? Was I being controlling or putting them down? We all of us who are parents fantasize that we'll have these close relationships with our children and they will talk to us. And then it doesn't happen. Well, at some level, our kids just don't feel safe with us. And part of that is because we as parents have had such a hard time learning to just listen. We're so untrusting of our children's ability to figure out their own moral code and their own values, that we feel like we need to offer a brief sermon following every disclosure they make and caution them, with another caution. And, well, you better watch out for such and such, or, well, all right, but if you don't get A's this semester, you're in trouble, mister. And whatever it is, to just relax and let people around us start talking without communicating, even non-verbally, that we are disapproving. And that's an art, to be able to do that, to really be truly not just thinking you're open-minded, but to be truly open to what the other is willing to share. And you can't do that without also being okay with the fact that there are things they're not willing to share. Because if you start interrogating people, that is definitely not the direction that takes us towards safety. It's so hard because it's frustrating. We all want intimacy, and so we often clumsily grasp for it. and we try to clutch it and make it happen. There's no way to make it happen.
Mm.
You know, you can do your part, but the other person has to do their part.
Yeah.
And if they can't, then you don't get to have an intimate relationship with them. The one thing that's working in our favor, and this is something I learned at attending AA groups from a very elderly guy with, 30 plus years of sobriety. He talked about how there was no defense against love.
Mm.
And he was speaking of unconditional love, where even with somebody you really don't know, if you're truly a lover of human beings and you can convey to them that you love them, you may not like the way that they bark at you when they respond. Mm-hmm. You may not like the way they do other things. You may not like how really prickly they are when they're defensive. There are a lot of things you may not like, but is there anything you really love about them? And if you can find those things and kind of keep your eye on those things while you're listening, it makes it a lot easier for the room to feel safe.
Yeah.
And I have found that people, when they do feel loved, they're just drawn into that conversation. They want to open up. They want, because we have an inherent need to, I think, as humans, to be known and to be understood.
Yeah.
And that feels great for all of us. It helps if you've reached a place too in your life, you know, if you're the person doing this, where you have a sense of living a transparent life. Mm-hmm. You know, well, what about you? You know, have you ever gone through relationship failure? Well,
it's none of your business.
Yeah.
Next question.
Well, I was talking about you. You know, I asked first to say so many times I can't even begin to tell you how many times. Are you kidding me? And it just sucks all of the fear out of the room when you can be at peace with yourself and on your own process. So, you know, I think building intimacy is really a skill, and yet it's our higher calling as a species, because it's the gateway to true love and acceptance, not just romantic love or sexual love, but platonic love, brotherly love. And I would say even, you know, enjoying our country as a nation, to be able to say what we really love about our country, while at the same time being able to comfortably acknowledge its many flaws.
Yeah.
Because just like a human being, any group has not arrived. There's no group, any group, no matter how good, sure is far from perfect.
Yeah.
And to be okay with that, because we're working toward a more perfect union.
Nice. Said so beautifully. Have you ever seen a relationship that worked that didn't have intimacy? Like if both people are like, we don't do that, and then they just like, is that something that ever?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm waffling on these kind of questions, because they're good questions, but I would say it depends, and it depends on what you mean by work. Because there are people who are mentally ill, and he and she, or he and he, get together, and it works in the sense maybe they stay married forever, or it can work, especially if you're using merely the metric of longevity of the marriage. Yeah, I guess it worked. They were married for 52 years.
Yeah.
If that's what you mean. But that's not what any of us mean by work anymore. What we mean is, did they have a meaningful connection? And without intimacy, no, there is no meaningful connection.
Yeah.
So and I say this with love to all the incels out there listening. I know you're afraid, and I know it's scary with the idea of getting close to women. But no matter what you think of yourself, I assure you, there are women in this world who can be loving and kind. It's just that really the problem is probably more on your side, in that you don't know how to establish intimacy and to make it okay whether she likes you or not. I think every one of us men has to get to the point where we're okay with the idea that she likes us or she's going to take a pass.
Yeah. It's huge.
Yeah.
And once you get there too, it's amazing.
Isn't it? It's very liberating.
Very liberating. Yeah.
It absolutely is. And with those women with whom you could have real intimacy. I think a guy who's an incel or even just a typical average guy could then be quite lovable. She just may not have romantic love for him, but she might have a if she's capable of loving people at all, she could have a deep appreciation of him as a human being, for how not controlling he is, and how what a pleasure he was to talk to, and the other interesting things that he shared from his interesting life.
Yeah.
As long as he's taken the time to build a life worth living. I think those kinds of conversations can always be good. So, I hope people can hear this, because it's just such a relaxing, wonderful place. It's such a liberating place to be free of that kind of need to close the sale on any individual person, to get their name on the bottom line of a contract of love.
That's a good way of putting it. And then also, you also mentioned with intimacy how it's the main way in order to grow a relationship beyond with sex, for instance. It's a lot of times, sometimes couples will be having sex, and then they're like, oh, well, now everything's kind of becoming stale, or it's becoming the same old thing, the same person. But you say, or I've heard you say, the remedy to that is intimacy.
Yeah, the perfect sex life isn't made up of just titillation. Titillation, despite the naughtiness sounding word of the word, it's actually just about the arousal to physical stimuli. So if she finds him handsome and he finds her beautiful, they have a level of titillation. But without the intimacy, titillation quickly pales, because we're always exposed to it whenever we're with that person. So the one and the double whammy here is, we can conclude erroneously that because we have an amazing sexual experience on the first date, or the first month, or the first whatever period of time it is, that we are intimate, because I never had a woman do that with me in a parachute before, or I never did this other thing before. Well, then again, that's playful, or it's titillating, but it's not necessarily intimacy. And the intimacy is what makes the other person ageless. So for him to look at her and to see her as beautiful today as she was 30, 40, 50 years ago, that's only possible when you're associating intimacy with your sex life, and, to be more specific, love and pleasure with orgasm. So if you're having sex with your partner regularly over a period of 30, 40, 50 or more years, they will continue to be just as attractive as they always were. If I probably should have said even more, because that's been my experience, is that with intimacy, it's like turbocharging the beauty. And I know intellectually, for example, that my wife has aged in the 30 years I've known her, but I'm really one of those memes of that older guy who finds his wife 30 years later that attractive.
Yeah.
I always thought that was BS or some romantic hokey.
Yeah, it's a great thing to, that's a lot of people still do. Like Bill Maher, for instance, he's a single man who's, a comedian, and he has that sort of idea. And that's one of the main things he struggled with as being in a marriage. He's like, how can you last it out or go on with it? That's why I wish he could have you on the podcast to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and my heart goes out to him, because if you don't get this part figured out to share intimacy, and it's something I don't have control over, I can work on my side of it, but I can't make the other person do it, or have the ability to do it, or even be interested in doing it if they have the ability, interested in doing it with me. So I'm really I'm kind of out of, it's not about control, right? And I don't know how it has worked historically for Bill, but if he's not had that, and he's of a certain age, and he's looking around him, and the women interested in him are of a certain age, then maybe he's not attracted to them. But I would say that's okay. There's no rush. The rush is learning to develop the intimacy skills that will allow you to get close, and finding that woman who makes that amazing conversation that's just so captivating you can't walk away, where her sense of humor and her brilliant intellect and her insight into human nature is just so wonderful you could listen to her forever. Now that is pretty interesting. And after a while, you start noticing, wow, her skin is really beautiful, or her hair looks lovely, or I really like the way she's dressed. And whatever it is, we men don't typically have a hard time sexualizing things eventually, but we can, we can work on this intimacy thing. So we make the mistake of thinking the great sex is intimacy, or that the great sex means we have a great relationship or a great connection. And it doesn't mean that at all. And so, yeah, we do have to develop the intimacy right along. It's and to not wait until after marriage to do that.
Yeah, and you also explain intimacy as a ladder, which I really like. That it never ends. It only gets higher and higher and higher levels.
Right.
And with that, I would say, what do you think is happening? Is that like some energetic intersection of a man and a woman, or whoever, or two people coming together, and like what is going on?
Well,
it's a hard question.
It's a profound question, and it's really interesting to me to think about. But my first impulse is to say, I think love is infinite in itself. And so with each passing week, I get to know my wife better because we have intimacy. So she'll be sharing ideas and experiences, because we're not in each other's pockets 24/7. We each do have our own lives.
Yeah.
And I come home and I want to hear about her day, and she wants to hear about my day. And so we're sharing our lives with each other. And I find myself going deeper and deeper into that zone. And, what would love be? I mean, even to imagine limits on it. No, I can't even imagine that there's a limit on that. And, for certain people, like those perhaps with borderline personality disorder, they see love as a zero-sum game. And typically, not always perhaps, but typically. And so if I love this person, that means I have less love for this other person. So if I love the children, then I have less love for my wife. Or if I love my friends, I have less love for my girlfriend. And that's just absolutely untrue, because, and I think I like what religion does with this, because it generally sends us the message that we're created in the image and likeness of God. And so, and like God, we have certain, or at least the idea of God, we have certain aspects of our being that are infinite. And our ability to love, the more love I give, I don't find that the reservoir is like drawing closer to the bottom.
Can't get any more love out.
Yeah, it never seems to run out. The more love I give, it seems like the more love I have, the more love I'm feeling. So that's, I think, what's going on. And, it's so amazing that our species invented language. We seem to be truly unique in that. And I love animals, and I love all the stories about animal language, but the human species has developed language to a point that's like no other. And for us, the ability to share linguistically, like we were talking about with that quote from Wittgenstein, once we precisely identify the concept, then the symbol of that word gets attached to that concept. And now we can use it as shorthand to communicate more effectively, more efficiently with the people around us. And that would be my plea to the listeners out there is, to abandon all uses of the word intimacy to mean sex, because we've got perfectly good words for sex: intercourse, doing it. And I'm not even going to get into all the funny ones, because there are plenty of funny ones. But to use the word intimacy for that ability to safely share our lives with one another, or some dimension of our lives with one another.
Great. And
apologies to Bill Maher.
Yeah. I mean, to me, like, it's something that when he would bring that up, or, it's just from watching his podcast and stuff. And I don't know all that's happening with it all, but he's had discussions with people that say that. And to me, it seems like again, like he just doesn't have the words for it even, or even the understanding of it. Like for me, working with you, I feel like the idea of a relationship has, in a really true intimate relationship, it's kind of, it's so powerful, it's almost terrifying in a way, but also thrilling and also amazing, but and also like, whoa, it's like I really need to get intentional with this stuff. And if I, this is a journey that I can take on this planet if I so choose,
Mm-hmm.
and I now
Mm-hmm.
have the language in order to make it happen. And do I want to go down that road with a person? That's why, like, I'm single now, but it's like when I do get in the next relationship, it's like, here we go, this is going full into it all.
All right, ladies, you heard that.
Yeah.
You can write into stevening.com, ask for
Yeah.
Jason. Um, I, I couldn't agree more. I made a joke, but I really was feeling what you said. And I think that love is the highest calling of our species. I think it's the most amazing thing that we can do as not only a social species, but as a eusocial species, in the sense that Edward O. Wilson talked about our being a eusocial species. And we have so much specialization. That's part of being a eusocial species, where we have doctors and lawyers, and even doctors are divided into hundreds of subspecialties, and lawyers as well. And it just, even writers, there are thousands of writers who write so many different genres and so many different types of writing. And I love the ability we have to specialize. I know, for example, I'm never going to be as funny as Bill Maher. Mm-hmm. He has mastered comedy to the point where he's forgotten more, as the saying goes, than I will ever learn. Mm-hmm. And I love that about him, and I can appreciate that about him and lots of other comedians. But I think I can make it through life happily without having a world-class level of comedy talent. Mm. I don't think I can make it happily through life without knowing how to really love and be loved. So that's why I'm so fixated on managing sexuality intelligently, because and this is part of managing sexuality intelligently. Yeah. If you don't understand what intimacy is, you're incapable by definition of managing sexuality intelligently.
It's the mic drop. All right. Well, thank you for that. And let's shoot it off to let's wrap up the conversation and bring up a listener question.
Sure.
So again, if you have a question for Steve, you could go to stevening.com, fill out the contact form, and write us in. After every episode, at the end of each episode, we read a question and Steve will answer it. So here is the question for this week. I listened to your podcast on the Madonna whore syndrome. You didn't mention it working in reverse, where a woman marries a nice guy who is a good provider, but she's not into him sexually. What are your thoughts?
Whoa. That's a bit of a stumper, isn't it, for me? I love these questions that are outside of my experience, and that's a good one. I think the reason we use the term Madonna whore as a syndrome or a complex or a handle on describing that way of thinking is because women are sexualized in a way that men are not. Mm-hmm. And we in our culture, and I mean in human culture, for the last 50,000 years, we've been thinking of women in this way. And then with the advent specifically of religion, there was a moral overtone that I think took it even to another level. So we do think about women this way. But I think what she's describing is a situation where that's really different. And it's kind of an ugly truth. And I don't even like to say it, but here goes. She asked. So, a couple of possibilities. One is she fell into platonic love and he seemed like a reasonable choice. But without passion and without a sexual attraction, she really doesn't love him in the way that he wanted to be loved. Mm-hmm. Just like we can all love somebody like Albert Schweitzer, a philanthropist who gave of himself and helped people throughout Africa have a better life and all of that. But that doesn't mean any of us want to marry him, even if he were alive. And it's the same way, I think, with admiring a good guy for his stability, his work ethic, his good-heartedness, his gentle nature. But if he's not doing it for anybody sexually, that's kind of a time to get intimate and admit that it ain't happening.
Yeah.
And for him to be honest with himself, because only a fool would miss the warning signs of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm a fool sitting across from you who has.
Okay. Well, and here's what I mean by fool. We all know from our experience that if we're madly, deeply in romantic love with somebody, we can't keep our hands off of them.
Mm-hmm.
And for him to ignore that, I think would be his own neediness getting so ahead of himself that he's not really being honest with himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not saying, yeah, she admires me at a certain level, but that's not all I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of my sexual needs, as again, guilty of self-promoting in that book, We're All Like This, we have a need to desire the other person in a sexual relationship. And if we don't have that desire, as she does not in this question, if she doesn't have that desire, then she's not going to really be able to have a successful relationship with him. And if he, in his need to be desired, doesn't have that, it's going to be like trying to live on empty calories. You know,
it's not easy.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible. And I've had that relationship, you know, where somebody admired me, but they just weren't that into me. And it's very painful.
Yeah.
Very painful. And it's a common enough mistake. I mean, we can all make it. And it's pretty easy because somebody might love a lot of things about us, but as they say in certain movies, but I don't love you in that way.
Yeah.
You know, and that's,
but there's been so many times, like going off this question in my own relationship, in my last one, it was like things weren't happening in the bedroom, or there were things that were difficult, and I just was like, I tried to bring it up, and then it was she kind of shut down with it, and then I'd be like, oh, well, I don't want to push, you know, I want to be kind of, she's not ready to talk about this stuff, so I'll just kind of let it go, and then I let it go, then a day goes by or 2 days go by, and then, you know, however long passes, and it's still the struggle that's going on and going on and going on. And now, like, after going through that and learning all this, I would just be like, sit down, have a conversation, set up the time for us to discuss or have the fight, quote unquote.
Right.
And just be like, hey, you know, I noticed that this isn't happening for, like, if we're gonna be in a relationship, this is what I kind of need from you. If you can't give that to me, then, you know, we're not going to be able to, like, have some kind of conversation, do it in a nice,
absolutely,
but just, and I didn't, and I neglected that, and she didn't own it either, and she didn't say it until many years later, or much longer later, even though she said she was over it like a year and a half into the relationship, but just didn't really express that.
Right. I would say she probably didn't have her words either.
Yeah, I think we're both like that.
Yeah, and it's, you know, that's really something I hope we're going to talk about someday, is fair fighting. But if, you know, when we get there, because it isn't about being destructive, it's about creating a new clarity of in the truth, right? And I think the man you are today, as I've gotten to know you, I don't think you would be in a relationship with someone who hadn't already evidenced that she was, as I like to say sometimes, goo goo gaga crazy for you.
Yes.
Who couldn't keep her hands off of you.
Yeah, she's not ripping my shirts off, then she's got to go.
Right. And I know that actresses can imitate that in a movie, but you can't imitate it indefinitely in a relationship.
Yeah.
And so to find, you know, you can just look at somebody's face, and after a while you can see it's just not there.
Yeah.
And my own wife, and what's weird is, I mean, I look in the mirror once in a while, and it's not all really attractive. And yet my wife still has that reaction for me. So I know it's not about looks. I know it's not about age. I know it's really about finding somebody you're compatible with. Now, I know other men who are not comfortable with that kind of physical expression of love,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't crave that sort of, in terms of a continuum of physical affection. If you're craving, let's say, an 8
Mm-hmm.
on a scale of 1 to 10, there are other people who are perfectly content at a 3 or a
Yeah.
2.
Yeah.
So, I think everybody needs to find out what's their comfort level, because your ex, I'm sorry, I called you a fool. I didn't know it was you, but
It was me the whole time.
but your ex, I don't know that she is somebody who operates at a 3. I don't know that that's her normal,
Mm-hmm.
or that she just wasn't that into you. But either way, again, it's a distinction without a difference, right?
Yeah.
Because it just won't work for you,
Yeah.
because you're more of an 8.
Yeah. Well, I know that now. And I think it was also just like we just didn't have the words. And like, it's like that's what I love about this sort of stuff, these conversations, because they just allow me to understand it. And again, it's sometimes things need to get repeated again and again to really kind of work inside my mind and like understand it at a deeper level.
I think they always need to be repeated, at least for me. And that was something I learned again in my 12-step experiences, attending a variety of 12-step groups. I just noticed how often they were repeating things and how helpful it was. I remember one day somebody said something like "one day at a time," which is a famous saying.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the day it dropped meaningfully into my brain.
Oh, nice.
I'd heard it 1,000 times,
Yeah.
but it was like, oh, that's what they mean. Oh, yeah. Now I get it.
Uh-huh.
And once you see it, you really can't unsee it.
Yes.
But I think what happens, a lot of us are in our heads and we just cognitively process information without integrating that information into what we call our heart. But whatever that emotional center in the brain is, we haven't yet integrated it and into our heart and into our lives. So what I imagine, is a future for you that includes you dating and dating and dating. And then, some women are going to make an offer that you find quite attractive, but then you'll evaluate, how's it working for me in the affection department?
Mm-hmm.
And you almost have a hard time talking about it at that point if it isn't.
Yeah.
Because if you can talk about it up front, that on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm an 8.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? And a better way to do it is to turn over the cocktail napkins and write your numbers secretly and turn them over so that everybody can be more likely to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And because you don't want to end up with somebody who is feeling pressured to be something they're not.
Yeah.
And so I just don't even see you inviting somebody like that into your home, into your life in that way.
They stay outside. They don't come near me. I'm not joking.
But the funny thing
but I
is,
love them all.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a lot of truth to that because they can all be very lovable.
Yeah.
And but not for me.
Yeah.
This one's not for me. And just like I'm not the right guy for the vast majority of women. And when I say vast majority, I mean like 99% of women are going to take a pass. But that's okay, because I think we all get our fair market share. There's a percentage of people out there, but that means to me, and I'll say this before signing off, I think the norm in dating for all of us is we all have a responsibility to ourselves to check out the scene and date a variety of the talent. And the number that I would hold in mind if I were you listening to this is to be dating about 30 different people. And with the experience of 30 different people under your belt, you'll have more of a sense of what the opposite sex has to offer, or the same sex, whatever you prefer. And you'll be able to know more about what works for you and what doesn't work for you, to marry or move in with the first person who's nice to you. Huge mistake. Yeah. Don't ever do that.
All right. That's a great way to end. And I do want to do a podcast on that 30 dates as well.
Oh, yeah.
Just really get into that.
The nuts and bolts of that would be good. That'd be really good to do that.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for listening, and see you next week.